Please welcome President Tourism Economics, Adam Sachs.
Well, good afternoon. These are interesting times again. It seems like each time that we're together, there are new things for us to focus on. I consider all of the chaos to be job security for all of the economists out there. What I'm going to try to share with you in a relatively short period of time is our view of where we are right now in a period of economic uncertainty, to be sure, and the implications of that on our industry. And my title alone is somewhat of tipping my hand, right? Can the hotel industry defy economic gravity? That on its own implies some sort of downward force that we are experiencing, or shall we say that we anticipate in the coming months. The question is, how will our industry react to this pending period of economic weakness? Well, let's go ahead and start with some perspective. We are not in a period of economic weakness in one sense if you look at the labor market. The unemployment rate is at 3.6% right now. You have to go back to the late 60s to find a time when the unemployment rate was that low. What were you doing in the late 60s? That was when the unemployment rate was this low, right? So some 50 years ago. And we're not seeing things falling off right now, are we? Right? Another more than 300,000 jobs added in the month of February. So what is going on? Well, people are worried, right? And we can say that at very least, right? There's probably a fair amount of worry within this room. And so if you look at consumer sentiment or consumer confidence, the two main measures of that, we do see that worry kind of percolating. Why? Well, there's really one culprit. Now, there are a lot of things that will ripple out from this, but this is the epicenter, and that is inflation. Right now, with the latest data showing that prices are 6% higher than they were 1 year ago, that means in like the most basic sense, the average household is spending another $400 a month on the same goods and services that they bought a year ago. And surely this leaves a mark on the balance sheets, on the purchasing power, and on the psyche of consumers and therefore the economy. And that is absolutely happening. If you look at income data, this is real personal income and nominal personal income. In nominal terms, hey, we're up 13% compared to where we were about 3 years ago. You back out that inflation and we're dead even. No growth in real personal income once you back out inflation. So it's not surprising that people are just a bit worried. But add to that because the Fed is so dead set on dealing with this problem, it's raising interest rates, which is having all sorts of unintended consequences, not to say the least within the banking sector. But we see it very acutely within the housing market. We either look at purchases of existing homes or of new homes. You could say, yes, something happened in the past year. Yes, mortgage rates approaching 7%. That's what happened. And of course, this has completely undermined what's going on in the housing market. But it's not just housing. It's manufacturing as well. And if you look at the ISM, the Institute for Supply Management, their index, anything below 50 on this index shows manufacturing is contracting. It's been doing so since late summer. And particularly, if I look at new orders, what we see is a bit of a leading indicator that the manufacturing industry is going to sustain a period of contraction in the coming months. So these are areas of weakness that you begin to see, and the cracks in the facade become more evident when you start to look at what's going on with households and their taking on of debt. And here I've broken it out by income group. And what's interesting is that nearly every single income group has taken on, this is consumer credit, basically credit card debt over the last 6 months. Now, shout out to the 1%ers who are all living within their means still. But nevertheless, when you look at across the broader market, you do see that inflation is beginning to have an effect on the way that people are spending money and taking on debt. And so where does this lead us, right? I'm leading you somewhere, right? I'm leading you toward the likely conclusion that we are headed toward a period of economic weakness. And in fact, there's a leading indicator that the Conference Board produces that does a pretty decent job at predicting where GDP is headed. And in the most recent reading in February, it fell for the 11th consecutive week, and it's going to fall further in March, to be sure. Right? And you can see, if you can squint, that that red leading indicator has already fallen below that threshold where we'd ordinarily see GDP begin to fall. And the credit markets are bearing this out as well. These gray shaded areas are past recessions, going back to 91, 2001, 2008, 2009, and of course 2020. And you can see that commercial and industrial loans, right, when the conditions for those loans have tightened, we've then seen a recession typically. And we're indeed in a period of tightening as far as financial conditions. You can see that in the blue line. Of course, we don't see a gray shaded area yet, but this is what it does seem to be portending in our near future. And so all of this good news that I've shared with you is leading to this one chart of what Oxford Economics, my parent company, is expecting in the coming couple of years. What I'm showing you on the first part of the chart, the left side, is our quarterly GDP forecast. And you ought to be able to see there that in the third and the fourth quarter, we expect GDP in the U.S. to contract. Peak to trough, how much is it going to fall over those 6 months? About 1%. Which means still, and this is important, for the year 2023, we expect GDP to rise. Actually, for the year, we expect GDP to rise about 1%, notwithstanding a pretty weak finish. And all of that is due to what we are seeing now and what we expect to continue to see through the second quarter. Now, you should ask, why so mild? Now, you shared a fair amount of bad news so far. Why is it such a mild recession? Well, it really just has to do with liquidity. And the fact is that even with all the noise and the financial turmoil that we're watching so closely, households have an incredible amount of cash still on hand. Corporations, the same thing. And the same with state and local governments, whose fiscal position is very, very strong, making it very different from past recessions. And in fact, if you look at what we're expecting for this recession, and you compare it to past recessions all the way back to post-World War II, this will stand out, and if it goes down as I am laying out for you, as one of the more mild recessions in our history, and in fact, very close to what we saw in 1991, with that peak-to-trough drop in GDP of about 1%. Within this modeling that we've done, we expect the unemployment rate to rise from its current rate of 3.6% up to 5%. You can probably think back to periods of time where the economy was doing just fine and unemployment rate was 5%, and we were all feeling pretty good about it. But this is the scenario that we think is likely. Now, we'll see jobs begin to shed as we move to the second half of the year if it plays out as we expect. But to the point where, because of the labor market conditions as they are, we don't expect it to get much worse. Why? Well, here's real simple math. Right now, there are about 5 million people who are unemployed in the U.S. That's what 3.6% of the labor force is. There are 11 million job openings right now for those 5 million job seekers. So about a 2 for 1. So you can imagine that as the U.S. economy enters into a period of economic weakness, that companies, for sure, they will lay off some staff, but they will also pull back on those job openings. They'll close some of those job openings. And so different than what we've seen going into past recessions, we're actually going to see the labor market be affected by that dynamic of closing job openings as well as some layoffs. Therefore, the unemployment rate impact is relatively modest, and that further gives us reason to think that this recession would also be modest. So this gets to the main question, all right? Let's just, for argument's sake, let's say that this forecast is correct, all right? What should we expect as far as the effect on the hotel industry? And I'm just going to focus for my time with you. I'll speak about rate a little bit, but I want to focus mostly on demand. And so if you look at what happened in 1991, GDP fell, as I mentioned, about 1%. Hotel room demand during that period of time of the recession fell about 4%. In 2001, a much more mild recession. In fact, GDP didn't even technically fall. But because of primarily 9/11, the hotel industry was hit quite hard with a 7% drop in demand. And then we hit the great financial crisis in 2008 and 2009. And there, with a historic drop in GDP, 4% drop in GDP, we saw a 9% drop in room demand. So here's the question that I would think would be a reasonable one to ask. Should we just pencil in this one? I mean, I've told you that we think GDP is going to fall by 1%. Should we just expect that room demand will fall by about 4%? And the rest of our time together is going to be a rather prolonged answer to this, which is going to be summarized in the word no. And I'm going to share with you 4 reasons why, so you don't just have to take my word for it. Why do I think that the travel industry, that hotel room demand in particular, and prices as well as part of that, are in a position to defy this economic gravity in a way that we have not seen? If you know me, and some of you know me, know that I try not to roll my eyes out loud when people talk about new normals. I really do. But what I want to tell you is that in one sense, we haven't seen this before, right? And here are my reasons. Let's start here. U.S. households are in a position of strength. Now, I share with you they've taken on some debt, and that's to be sure. But the big picture is the cost of that debt, and the cost of that debt is still very, very low. And in fact, the household debt service as a share of income is about 14%. It was 18% in 2008, 2009. And so that burden of servicing that debt for households is historically low. And on the asset side, even with the volatility we've seen in markets, you can see that U.S. household assets are really, really strong and have followed a very strong upward trajectory even with the losses that we have seen. Marriott, in their earnings call in February, said this: "To date, we have not seen signs of demand softening. Certainly trends could change quickly, but booking demand and pricing remains strong." So even while these sort of fault lines are presenting themselves, consumer confidence is really low, inflation is taking a bite out of income, we're not seeing any effect. And part of that does have to do with the balance sheets. And in fact, U.S. households now still have $1.6 trillion in savings that they did not have 3 years ago. This is not total, this is additional from 3 years ago. So even while that has been drawn down over the last couple of years, it is still historically high. And I've gone ahead and broken this out by income group as well, just to simply point out that the main customers of the hotel industry are where these savings reside. Right, some $600 billion in the top quartile of income earners, another $400 billion in the third quartile of income earners. And this savings is a war chest. It is a buffer against a softening economy, and that money is available for travel. And we'll talk about that a little bit more. Here's another piece why I think we can be relatively encouraged about where we're headed as far as the effect on the consumer. Inflation is almost certainly likely to moderate in the coming months. If you look at the Small Business Optimism Survey done by the NFIB, optimism survey can be a bit of a misnomer at times because sometimes people are downright pessimistic, but that's what they're measuring. And one of the things they ask is, are you going to raise selling prices? Are you planning to raise selling prices? And that's the line that's going down further is the ones that are planning to sell. It's kind of the net positive negative. And you can see how far that's fallen over the last couple of months. And so clearly there's a deceleration in that. We see it in the supply chain as well. Right? The supply chain tensions have basically evaporated. The cost of shipping is down to where it was pre-pandemic. All of these things lead us to the conclusion, in addition to what the Fed is intentionally doing in demand destruction through rate increases, and the likelihood that we hit a slowing economy, means that when we're here next year, and if I get invited back, right, depending on how this forecast works out, then we will be saying, you know, inflation is not on our minds. Certainly not in the way that it was when we were together in 2023. Second, pent-up demand. And this is critical, right? The prioritization of travel. This is what I want to tell you. This is still a thing. I know we were talking about this last year, but it's still a thing. And this is really important, like whether this is true or not, because this will determine is if the savings that I just talked about are put to work for travel or for something else, or are they just continue to be held as savings, right? These are the three options. And I believe that travel and hotel activity is first in line. Expedia in their earnings call from just in February said, we continue to see people are prioritizing travel over just about everything. Maybe it's still the effect of COVID. Maybe it's people realizing there's more valuable things to do with their lives, right? And Expedia's data is bearing out momentum and continued heightened interest in travel. And what's interesting is if you look at kind of how are consumers spending their money, if you only looked at retail sales, you'd start to get a little worried. Because retail sales have basically been flat since, well, 2021. But here's the thing. Consumer spending still increases. It's just not on retail. And it's growing in services. So while we've seen durable goods begin to plateau and non-durable goods do the same, spending on services has continued to rise. And this is a really important piece of math. Right now, consumers are spending about 66% of their consumption on services. Historically, that's been 70%. And so, in one sense, what we're saying is that we expect normalization, that things will go back to a normal distribution of how consumers spend their money, which means a further amount of growth in experiences, services, travel, even as that begins to take share back from goods. Survey data from Longwoods International, they run this survey twice a month. Their latest data from earlier in February found that 93% of travelers said they had leisure travel plans in the next 6 months. That's the highest it's ever been. So if you're looking for signs that people are going to say, you know what, I'm going to start pull back on travel, you're not going to find it in this survey. Now, you will find it in this survey. This survey is done by MMGY, and it's their portrait of the U.S. American traveler. But here's the thing. The households that are saying they're going to cut back over the next 6 months are all in the bottom 2 income groups, supporting what we were talking about earlier about the fiscal position of households in these income groups. And of course, inflation is highly regressive. And so the effects of inflation on these households is more acute. And that's why we do see some of the weakness. But if you look at where the lion's share of travelers are in the upper 3 groups, 100,000 and up, that's where we see continued strong intentions to travel. And it's not surprising then when you look at STR data that you do begin to see over recent weeks the greatest weakness as far as kind of pulling back is in economy class. Whereas you see generally, if you can look through the noise, continued building of occupancy across luxury, upper upscale, and even upper midscale. Another point I want to add to this argument is this idea of the effect of remote and hybrid work. Longwoods, again, in a recent survey, found that 34% of travelers say they plan to travel as they work remotely. This is not traveling for work, this is traveling while working, right? And this is better, if you ask me. And it's incredible, actually, when you think, 10% saying they're going to work remotely away from home in another U.S. location for 1 to 4 weeks, another 9% in various locations over the next 2 years, another 8% in another location for 4 or more weeks, right? And 7% plan to travel abroad. But here's the deal, 1 in 3 travelers are saying they're going to do this. And this is a market that did not exist nearly to the extent that it does 3 years ago. And in fact, as I've tracked this survey, this number has only grown over the last year. And so we have not realized the full benefits of this by any means. And this is, again, going to be kind of wind in the sails of the industry, even as the economic winds begin to die down. United, in their earnings call from the fall, pointed this out, said there's been a permanent structural change in leisure demand because of the flexibility that hybrid work allows. This is not pent-up demand. It's the new normal. Third, businesses. Let's talk about business travel. Still restoring necessary travel, still rebuilding. And this is an important dynamic because even as the economy may stall out, you still have businesses that are not traveling to the extent that they ordinarily would. So where in a past recession we would have expected to see business travel pull back, what if business travel is already back? And this is the situation that we're in. Our most recent survey with J.D. Power that we do in airports, and by the way, if you ever need to get free Wi-Fi in an airport and you have to answer a few questions to get that free Wi-Fi, and you think, what is in it for me? The answer is this chart. Okay? Fourth quarter is the dark blue lines, and I'm comparing it to the third quarter and the second quarter before it. What we found in the fourth quarter of 2022 is that business travelers expected to travel at 101% of 2019 levels, more than they did in 2019 over the coming 6 months. That's a pretty big jump from 95% in the third quarter, and you see it especially for conferences and trade shows and for customer and stakeholder meetings. Not quite there, but recovering on internal meetings. And so you see this momentum that is still behind us in terms of the rebuilding of business travel. And Delta, in their earnings call earlier this month, pointed this out. Consumer demand remains healthy. Advanced bookings significantly ahead for each month of the March quarter compared to 2019. And in our recent corporate survey, results were positive. 96% of respondents expecting to travel as much or more in Q1 than Q4. So you see this momentum that exists on the business travel side that is going to prevail through economic weakness. And let me go to my fourth and final point of why we think travel is going to defy economic gravity. And that is international. We expect international markets to continue to rebuild. And if I can use this metaphor with you, the economic tide we do expect to go out in the second half of this year. But the tide of international inbound travel will be the prevailing tide as we move through 2023 and indeed into 2024. And in one sense, you could just look at the monthly data and see this. But you also see it in terms of what airlines are doing, in terms of putting new planes in the sky as well. But if you look at monthly data, this is travel to the US, and I've just indexed it to 2019. I'm going to be doing this for a while, indexing to 2019 when it comes to international. So just bear with me. Right now, at the last data, we've got some February data on inbound. We're at, for the world, 73% recovered. So 3/4 recovered just in that month. Here's the deal. If you just hold that for all of 2020, the rest of 2023, it's going to be a much better year than 2022, which started out in the range of down like 60%. Right? So, but we don't expect that. We actually expect continued growth on international inbound because of what we're seeing on the aviation side in particular. But Canada, around 86% recovered in the latest data. Mexico, around 70% recovered. When I break it out by region, you get even more of a picture of sort of, if I can call it upside. Right? Upside with Europe at 80% recovered, with Latin America at 77% recovered, with Asia at just about half recovered. And so while we expect some of these markets, especially Asia, to come back slowly, we do expect that to be forward. And this is important because 2022 was a year where U.S. outbound travel recovered really, really fast. So U.S. outbound in 2022 was fully recovered by the end of the year. But inbound, of course, not. And so the outbound is a drain on demand, right? So they're not traveling domestically, they're traveling internationally. We didn't get the inbound yet. 2023, and moving into the latter part of this year especially, is going to be when we see inbound begin to fill in some of the gap. So that's a net positive relative to last year. Does that make sense? American, their January earnings call. We expect a strong demand environment to continue in 2023 and anticipate further improvement in long-haul international travel. And so let me try to summarize all this a little bit. I'm going to pan out. If you look at STR data, monthly data, percent change relative to the same month in 2019. What you see over the last 3 months of data is that we exceeded 2019 levels of room demand. in each month, holding anywhere between 0.5% to 1% ahead. No sign of weakening there. And in one sense, all I'm saying is that it's not going to go backwards. That the momentum, that all of the fundamentals of where consumers are, where businesses are, where international travelers are, should sustain actual continued growth on this. Let me give you a snapshot why. If you look at the historic relationship between hotel room demand and GDP, and go back all the way to the beginning of this millennium, what you see is they tend to move pretty closely together. And in fact, when they decouple during an economic cycle, they tend to find one another again. Where are we now? Well, in the fourth quarter of 2022, we can say we were well behind where room demand ought to be relative to the state and the growth of the economy that we've experienced. So what I'm going back and saying is maybe the main point of my presentation isn't that this time is different. Maybe the main point of my presentation is that things are going to get back to normal. And that room demand is going to find its rightful place relative to the size of the economy. And indeed, that is what the STR Tourism Economics Forecast implies. And Vail Ross is going to share this in detail tomorrow, and you're not going to want to miss it. She's going to give you a lot more on kind of the outlook on the hotel industry. But let me just share this. This is not that crazy of an idea, that even though the economy may go into reverse for the latter part of this year, that room demand, again, relative to 2019, as I look quarter to quarter in the second half of this year, continues to eke out gains. Small as they may be, continue to grow, and then for that growth to accelerate into 2024. So where have we been? This is it. Mild recession. We think it's likely in the second half of this year, with inflation, higher interest rates really leaving a mark. Strong balance sheets should limit the downside there. Nevertheless, travel is uniquely positioned to weather this downturn. Why? Households, strong fiscal position, pent-up demand, the prioritization of travel, business travel continue to be rebuilt, and then the ongoing incoming tide of international inbound. Thank you very much for having me with you again.